closely as many others. The town and village operate two largely independent sewer systems, and they do cross paths at the final point just before the effluent gets discharged into Lake Ontario. They share the same pipe, but otherwise they are independent. But it just so happens that in sharing the same pipe, the waste stream from the village does travel all the way to the town sewer plant, which would potentially make logistically the consolidation more feasible in this particular arrangement. 2016, conceptual discussions were had regarding consolidation. The town and the village are contemplating significant capital investments. It made sense. The leadership on both parts decided it would make sense to at least talk about why not make one larger investment, and or why should we? 2019, the joint study was approved. The findings from that study were concluded in August of 2020, and the village still, to its point, wanted to get more information about what a potential consolidation would look like. At that point, the language was being used, it was called regional. The working group decided to not really continue the use of that regional language, and the term has been a consolidated sewer district. So the sewer working group was formed at the behest of both the town and the village, so they both invited participants, town board and village board members, staff from the town and the village, residents from both entities, and business owners were sought from both entities as well. I was selected as the moderator to be the facilitator, not necessarily the chairman with a vote per se. The group largely came up with the recommendations amongst themselves. I just tried to keep the dialogue moving forward and make sure that there was some sort of progress being made towards the goals that the group was charged with. So that being said, the goals the group was charged with were two primary goals in the bullet points that are in front of you. The one was to identify and present to this joint session what was considered at that point in time the pros and the cons of operating a consolidated sewer system, including treatment and collections. In addition, and this point was one that we took most to heart, was present an equitable, feasible, and cost-effective path forward for a consolidated system. What we're not going to necessarily talk about tonight is the working group was not formed to provide a recommendation to the village board on whether or not it should consolidate. So we are not providing a recommendation to the board for that effect. Our recommendations are, should a consolidation be approached in some way, shape, or form, we put forth a path that we thought was equitable, feasible, cost-effective, and fair to both the town and the village. That was our charge. As part of that charge, in addition to those key goals, there was some what we call scope of work items that were assigned to us. Look at the organizational structure of a potential consolidated district. How could that be organized? What are there precedents taking place in other communities? Debt finance. How do you deal with debt in a situation such as this? Review of existing assets and infrastructure. How has that been dealt with, including the collection system? Revenue generation opportunities. And of course, how would this impact potential for future growth within the community? The group met pretty much every other week early on, and then I held 6 or 7 separate meetings, and then we met pretty much weekly for the last month. The first meeting was in March. I would say that the time schedule for our charge was compressed. I think we had hoped that this could have been facilitated a little bit earlier, but the time constraints that the village is under, not of its own volition, but of the funding sources that it is seeking, has required us to move this forward a little bit faster than I think all of us would have liked. To that end, we came up with what we thought were some general recommendations. And I'm going to summarize those on the next slide, but this slide talks about the 6 key topic areas that were considered. Governance and operations. What options exist for governance and operations of a system where 2 consolidate into 1? Revenue, how do we share those revenue sources, and how do we even generate additional revenue? Is there flexibility? Collections, who maintains it? How is that transferred? How is that funded? Infrastructure, operations, maintenance, what happens to the actual land and the buildings? Who continues to own the land and the buildings moving forward? Debt, there's multiple ways to deal with debt, and we'll talk about some conceptual options there. We think there's 3. And staffing, how do we treat, and this was, I would say that this last item, number 6, was easily the most unanimous sentiment of everybody in that room, in that working group, felt, how do we treat the village employees fairly and equitably and ensure that they all have jobs and they're all treated as fairly and equitably as possible. It went without saying that everybody in the group felt that that was very important. So I'm going to give a very high-level overview of these 6 areas from the recommendations that we're making, and then we're going to dive into it just a little bit further in detail. So number 1, for governance and operations. The working group felt that the full consolidation of the systems was the most likely going to be the most efficient and effective moving forward. That included both the treatment and the collection systems. And the village, in that aspect, would have a special district. It would function as a special district within a consolidated sewer system. Revenue generation. A sewer reserve fund would be established up front and both into for an extended period of time, potentially in perpetuity, to service that village special district. It would be funded by village district users. Those funds would only go towards improvements and investments made within that village, special village district. So those costs would be controlled and constrained to investments required to maintain that existing system. Collections. A consolidated system itself would be actually responsible for the maintenance of the facility and of the collection system. Yet, what we discovered in our homework, we actually invited the executive director of Wayne County's Water and Sewer District to come, and he spoke at length about the efforts that they're undertaking. And one of the models that they suggested that they're using is the authority that they formed an authority. The authority maintains the district, and then any maintenance above a certain threshold dollar figure is then separately charged back to that special district in which that investment would need to be made. So if there was a pump station that needed to be reinvested in, that pump station investment, which would likely be above the threshold of a nominal figure of $10,000, that's a negotiable number. Anything above and beyond that figure would then be charged with, funded by that special district. And that's a way to control costs and protect users of the entire district. Infrastructure. It's recommended that the village treatment plant would be converted to a headworks-only facility where primary treatment of the influent, the first blush of treatment would take place, but the final stages of treatment would then be that stream of waste would be transferred and flowed down to the town's facility that would need to be improved to handle the extra flow, and the final treatment and discharge of the effluent would take place from the town's plant. The land and the buildings would be owned by the village. The village would maintain ownership of all land and buildings. There would be a lease back of any infrastructure that was being used by the consolidated system. That way the village would be able to utilize and maintain ownership and potentially construct additional buildings for storage or whatever its general needs would be. The village would maintain ownership of those facilities. There's multiple options, and I'm going to gloss over it now because there's a couple slides in that we'll talk about the debt options, but the discussion was retiring the debt, consolidating the debt, or just maintaining. So those were really conceptually the 3 options. And then finally, staffing, ensuring that all the village employees are retained and treated fairly in regards to their positions. So, in order to be as fair and equitable and efficient as possible, it was recommended by the working group that this take place over a transition period of 3 to 5 years. And that transition period, during the transition, there would be a set, determined, likely transition date. There would be a negotiated date as well. But there would be a joint sewer, town and village sewer transition committee that would be formed to help craft an intermunicipal agreement. And then during that transition period, however, the village would be maintained as full autonomy over its sewer system for control, existing budget structure, operations. It would function as the entity through the transition period in preparation for transition and consolidation. However, the IMA should touch upon those 6 key elements that we discussed previously: governance, infrastructure, collections, revenue generation, debt and staffing, and there may be other items that get rolled into that. So as part of that consolidated, the transition to consolidation, the recommendations for governance and operations, we touched upon some of them. The formation of the committee, village operating status quo, the formation of village special sewer district. During that time period, a collections and operations and maintenance charge and a capital charge right now we call them EDUs, equivalent dwelling units. That's kind of how we measure the flow of sewer based on a 60,000 gallon operation, or 60,000 gallons per year. A separate charge would be established, and that would be determined based on the operation of the existing village district. So we would be able to take the time, work with the finance department, work with the sewer department, work with the DPW, and really dive in from a dollars and cents perspective and understand what it takes on a cost per EDU, cost per user, what that charge should really be. To date, we don't know what that charge is. I think the village is heading in that direction, and it's done a lot of work towards determining what that exact charge would be for both the operations and then any sort of capital reserve. And I think the transition period would allow for that process to come to fruition and everybody to feel comfortable with that number. And then one of the suggestions was to actually rename the sewer system to the Webster Consolidated Sewer System, such that even in the branding of vehicles and letterhead, that village residents were part of, not the town, but they were part of a larger community entity that is just the Webster Consolidated System. Dealing with revenue. We got into a little bit of numbers here when we started talking about revenue. There's several different flows. There's residential flows, commercial and industrial flows, there's septage flows. We talked a lot about septage. I know a lot more now about septage than I probably really want to, but I feel it's good to know how these revenues are generated. So the sewer reserve fund that was mentioned earlier, it is recommended that would be started during this transition period by the village. In the village's current financial budget, they've allotted, well, there's an undistributed sum of funds, approximately $374,000, that we felt was obviously intended to build up a reserve fund. And that would continue to take place during the transition period. The example on the screen is a period of 4 years, which would basically provide a reserve fund approaching $1.5 million. And then at that point, upon transition, the establishment of that special sewer district within the consolidated system would take place, and that reserve fund would transfer. It would transfer out of the actual control of the village itself, but it would be set aside in use only for the village users within that district. So those monies would only be used towards offsetting costs for village users. There would be an agreement on the accretion and withdrawal of funds from that reserve to help offset and rebate EDU costs. So if if the reserve fund grew to a point where it was unnecessarily large, that money could be then drawn down in a budget cycle or across budget cycles as a rebate to those EDU users. So the operations and maintenance charge for collections in the village district would be lower than it had been. On septage revenue, there's ideas about how to share that revenue, but if any septage receiving was undertaken on the village property, those revenues were determined to flow directly to the village as part of the district itself to help offset those EDU charges. So the overall goal was revenue would come in to this special district and would be set aside for village users within this special district and not just consolidated into a town-wide fund. They would be specific for village users. And then opportunities for future growth. We went back and forth on how we identify opportunities for future growth, but the screen is, I wish it was larger, so you could understand exactly the size and scope of just the area of which the town and village of Webster draw sewer flows. The blue lines up in here is Webster, the village, the boundaries in black here. There are potential areas that could be additionally serviced, based on anticipated land use patterns. A consolidated system would allow for the servicing of those areas to take place in a more efficient manner, largely because there'd be one entity that could coordinate any changes in pipe sizing, if there are bottlenecks in the system, or how do we take out of district charges and pass them through to the appropriate beneficiary, either being the village district itself or the larger townwide district. Collections. As stated previously, the village would maintain during this transition period 100% of the effort and expense of the system. Post-transition, the funding mechanism for that maintenance and operations would flow through the special district. The effort component would be from the consolidated sewer agency, which would mean the town would be responsible essentially for all the effort moving forward through through the combined, what is hopeful to be the combined forces. And then the village residents will pay that separate EDU charge, and that would be specific to the district that they reside in. Infrastructure, just trying to move through this as quickly as I can. The town would complete the system improvements for the treatment plant. The village treatment plant would be converted to the headworks. If there was the option for a septage receiving station at the village, and should that be the agreed upon location, those revenues would then flow to the village as described previously. Village to retain the ownership of the lands, a nominal lease back, probably even just $1, to be honest, $1 a year. Could be more, that's a negotiable term. And then this joint transition committee would establish the investments required during the transition and possibly for a period of 5, maybe 10 years. There would be an agreed upon investment in capital across the system. So then budgeting for that could be done up front, and then that budgeting would reflect EDU charges moving forward. And that budgeting element would happen in a joint capacity during the transition period. And so moving on to debt. We came across what we thought were three potential options, and they're all really negotiable options between the town and the village. Should the village decide to explore this further. Option one could be potentially to even pay off their debt. Right? Some of those funds, some of that reserve fund that was brought forth, could be used to retire the debt early, so that at the end of the transition period, the village could wipe its hands of its debt related to its sewer system by retiring it early, about 6 years early. Right now, we believe that 2032 is when the full debt would be retired. At least the debt that's on the books today would be retired in 2032. We estimate that it could be done by 2026 that would come at a cost. Obviously, the cost of paying down that debt early would reduce the amount of funds that you would put into the reserve that would help offset operations and maintenance for the special district. So there's a trade-off and a balance there. So option B would be to have that debt consolidated into the special district. And the reason you set up the special district is because in the eyes of New York State, there is actually a separate entity that could take on such debt, right? So that entity in the village special sewer district could take on this debt, get transferred into it. It could also take on additional debt should it need to, should the reserve fund not be sufficient to support unexplained or unanticipated capital investments that were required. The goal is to obviously avoid that and build up that reserve fund such that that would never be the case. And option C would be the village could maintain the debt. It wouldn't have to do anything with it. It could just retire it. It would establish its own additional EDU charge to pay down that debt within the allotted time frame of another approximately 11 years. And, you know, there's so many different, the reason it's difficult to apply a number of dollar figures for like an EDU on that is because right now EDUs are $6,292. Next year it could be $6,100, and the following year it could be $6,000. We really don't know how large the user base will be within the village to spread these costs across, which is more of the ilk of why potential consolidation would be preferential and a full perspective, because the unknown risk of a smaller user base over time is something that could be eliminated on the village's part. It could be spread potentially. Certain costs, especially if those across the treatment perspective, would be spread across a much larger base of users. And finally, staffing. You know, town and village would essentially have individual agreements with those employees on how they can transition best from the village facility to the town plant based on their accreditation and their licensure, ensuring that they can maintain their compensation and benefit packages, and that, you know, they all keep their jobs. You know, luckily, we're not talking about 50 to 100 people. Luckily, it's a number of individuals that have worked hard, and we should be able to protect them moving forward. So, just in summary, the 6 topic areas again. It's really, this is just the same slide, but these are the 6 topic areas that we touched upon. Hopefully, we provided some food for thought on how we thought this could be organized. That being said, we are not providing specific recommendations on where we think EDU charges are going to be, or other recommendations regarding whether or not the village should consolidate. We think this is a viable option should it take that path. And with that, that is the conclusion of my presentation.